Welcome to Perspectives, a podcast where the clergy women of the First United Methodist Church of San Diego share their musings on scripture, theology, and what it has to do with us. This is the first episode of First Church's Bible study, digitally recorded, called Perspectives. For the next 5 weeks, we'll be covering the first 12 chapters of Exodus. Today, I have Reverend Brittany with me to have a conversation on this topic called A Mother's Love, based on chapters 1 and 2.
Thanks, Reverend Hannah. So I'm going to give just a brief background of what was happening before we get to Exodus 1 and 2. So Exodus is the second book of the Bible, and Genesis is the first. So before we get to Exodus, we need to just remember what was happening in the book of Genesis towards the end. So Joseph, the guy with the pretty coat, Joseph was in Egypt, and he was really well known, right? He was a Hebrew man. He was really well known. He had worked his way up and become a part of the government. He was in the king's court. And so many people knew Joseph. The Egyptians knew him and the Hebrews knew him. And so because he had gained so much social capital, when the famine came and hit the land, the Hebrews migrated over to Egypt. And because they migrated over to Egypt and Joseph himself was a Hebrew man, he was able to have influence over how they were treated, right? And so they weren't subjugated while Joseph was there. They had dignity. Well, Joseph dies, and he dies in the land of Egypt. And once he dies, and the generation that is with him dies, and the generation that is right under him dies, nobody knows who Joseph is anymore. The Egyptians don't know who he is. New folks have come into power. They're new pharaohs. And so nobody knows who Joseph is. But what the Egyptians know is that these Hebrew folks have populated. There are a lot of them, and they're doing really, really well in the society. They found their footing, even though they're exiled, right? And so what happens is the Egyptians become really concerned that the Hebrews are going to gain all of this power. And so they create a mandate that says there are too many of them. And so what we'll do is we'll kill their boys, right? When their sons are born, we'll have the midwives commit these acts, these heinous acts of slaughtering the innocent. And so Moses is a boy who was born during that time, and Shiphrah and Puah were the two midwives who birthed him.
And Reverend Brittany, don't you think these midwives, Hebrew midwives, were witty and wise in their oppressive situation?
Yes, they were.
Their excuses were the Hebrew ladies are different from the Egyptian ladies, and they give birth quicker than they arrive.
Right.
They use their wit to be defiant to these oppressive rules.
Yep.
And I see several other women in chapters 1 and 2, the midwives, the mother of Moses and sister, and even the Egyptian princess who used their wit, wisdom, courage, and defiance, not to follow the rules of oppression. And everyone had a job to do in there.
Exactly.
And there are some small instances of resistance in these chapters 1 and 2. So in this story, we can only imagine the threat and danger they're in, and how they get over those hurdles in a way that they can do in their power and position. But I would like to think about what was going on in that moment in their mind, the midwives at the instances, and the mother and the sister. Can you think about their positions and their thinking behind the scenes?
I mean, they had to be terrified. If you're willing to kill children, newborn babies, the innocent, what are you willing to do to me for not doing what you told me to do, right? If you're using this act of violence against a child, what are you going to do to my woman's body, right? And so I think of this story, when I think and read this story, I often think of the story of a woman named Margaret Garner. So in 1856, there was a woman who was enslaved in Kentucky. Kentucky was a slave state, and Ohio was free. Kentucky and Ohio are pretty close in certain parts. But at that time, politically and socially, that was not the case. And so this woman was enslaved, and she took her children over to Kentucky. They crossed over the Ohio, or she left Kentucky and went over to Ohio. They crossed over the Ohio River. And they were there for about 2 hours before the slave catchers came knocking on the door. They could see kind of the footprints as to where they were. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 said that if an enslaved person escaped, that they could be brought back right into enslavement, even if they were in a free state. So just because she was in Ohio, she wasn't free. And so she knew that these slave catchers were coming. She heard them knocking on the door. And so in an act of desperation, she did what Moses' mother did, right? Moses' mother puts him in the basket. She doesn't know if the crocodiles will get him. She doesn't know that he's going to make it to Pharaoh's house. All she knows is she wants this boy to not have the life of enslavement. And so this woman, Margaret Garner, does something comparable, and she kills her daughter, her 2-year-old daughter, in order for her not to go back into slavery. And she tries to kill herself. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and she's prosecuted and taken back into enslavement. But this woman's act of desperation to try to save her child, so she would rather hit her die, that baby to die, than to go back and to be subjugated and treated as less than human. These stories of the Bible, you know, are comparable to so many throughout history. And it's so sad, and yet they have so much to teach us.
Yes, and that's a sad story, and we get to compare these ancient stories with today's world or historical moments, and they actually change my perspectives along the way. And as I was listening to this story, it gave me a different image of God, or of understanding of God and God's sacrificial love, and actually brought me the image of God used in the book called The Shack by William Young. And I invite you to read, or other people to read the story. That story changed my understanding of God too. Growing up in a Korean Methodist church, we learned that God is always in the image of God the Father, who is always triumphant warrior, who is the judge, who comes to either bless or condemns people, who always play a big part in our human history and uses major figures in the Bible, like Abraham and Moses and Elijah or whoever, to make God's victorious story. But this story made me to think about God as a suffering mother, a woman. And when we think of God as a mother, I know it's a controversial image that we have been discussing for the past several decades. And that's a theological challenge to the image of God as the Father. And the image we are so used to, right? But still, when I go back to Korean churches or go back to people who refer to God, who only experiences God as the Father, I hear a little uneasiness when I say God the Mother and refer to God as she once in a while, not every day.
Yeah, I mean, I would have been one of those people way back in the way back that thought, you're crazy. God is mother. I've been taught that God is father, because growing up in my little Baptist church in New Jersey, I only heard of God as father, which is interesting, knowing that women give birth and that God is a creator in some analogies. So you would think that it would be easier for us to kind of make that parallel in some instances, but that hasn't been the case. And I know that I had been stretched throughout my theological journey, particularly in divinity school, to be like, you have a lot to learn, young grasshopper. And I am glad that I have expanded my horizon to begin to see God beyond the social constructs of my mind and to see God in so many broad and ordinary and extraordinary ways.
You know that I have come from a long way to have all these theological struggle along the way that got me to sick. And one of the redeeming grace was process theology that I was exposed to in my graduate school. And that's where I reconciled my understanding of the traditional God with my everyday experience of God. So with this text in front of us and the stories we shared and the conversation we had, I can think of God not only as transcendent, but immanent. God who is far, but at the same time near to us. God not only in major milestones in history, but in everyday struggle we face and all those tiny decisions we need to pull up in difficult situations. Not only personally, but also socially as well. So you and I always pull out these immediate responses to some of the comments we hear. And this is a good stretch for us. And I hope other church people also have this conversation with each other. And
I hope so. And that's where you come in, church people. It's your turn. We've done our talking, so now you can do yours. So we invite you to reflect on some questions, and you can join us in person on Wednesdays at 10:30 a.m. in Linder 4 for this in-person dialogue in small groups with each other. And we also have an option for online on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. on Zoom. So here are our questions for you to reflect on. Who are some of the women who have made small instances of resistance to make great impact in your life or in the world? How have women's roles changed from antiquity to now? And how would you describe God as mother in your own life? Some deep questions for some deep people. And we know that you'll have an excellent time exploring these together. And so we invite you to find an opportunity to join us and each other for more conversation.